Okay, Doug, we're live.
All right, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here for our event today on war crimes and whether or not Russia can be tried for that. To get us started, I'd like to turn the floor over to our Institute Associate Director, Erin King-Sweeney.
Thank you, Professor Kriner. Good afternoon and welcome to the Institute of Politics and Global Affairs at Cornell University. IOPGA's mission is to deepen discourse and raise understanding. Before we begin, a little housekeeping. On Wednesday, May 11th at 11 a.m., we will discuss the Ukrainian refugee crisis in Poland with Representative Malinowski and the Counsel General of Poland, Kubicki. On Tuesday, May 17th, at 7 p.m., we will discuss the development of the U.S.-China relationship with Representative Ami Bera. On Tuesday, May 24th, from 8:30 a.m. to 2 p.m., we will hold our State of Democracy Summit at the Cornell Club in New York City. A virtual option will also be available. As always, to register for programs, go to our website, iopga.cornell.edu. The link will also be in the chat to register for all programs this afternoon. The Institute of Politics and Global Affairs is a strictly bipartisan institute featuring speakers and programs from both sides of the aisle. These speakers have included President Bill Clinton, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, U.S. Army, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi, former White House Chief of Staff Reince Priebus, conservative pundit and CNN host S.C. Cupp, and many members of Congress, diplomats, and journalists. We're honored this afternoon to join us is Dean Jens Ohlin from Cornell University School of Law. Dean Ohlin became the Allan R. Tessler Dean on July 1st, 2021. He previously served as interim dean, vice dean, associate dean for academic affairs, and director of faculty research. His scholarly work stands at the intersection of four related fields: criminal law, criminal procedure, public international law, and the laws of war. Trained as both a lawyer and a philosopher, Dean Ohlin's research has tackled questions as diverse as criminal conspiracy and the punishment of collective criminal action, the philosophical foundations of international law, and the role of new technologies in warfare, including cyber war, remotely piloted drones, and autonomous weapons. Dean Ohlin's latest research project involves foreign election interference and the use of disinformation as a mode of statecraft by foreign actors. In a series of books and essays, he has explored how democratic states can marshal international and domestic legal tools to combat this new form of cyber interference. Dean Ohlin is also a dedicated teacher and the sole author of 3 case books in 3 different fields: international law, and criminal procedure. He is also co-editor with Claire Finkelstein of the Oxford Series in Ethics, National Security, and the Rule of Law, a steering board member of an international working group researching secondary liability for international crimes, and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Dean Ohlin, welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And then I'd like to introduce you to Professor Neta Crawford. Professor Crawford is chair of the Department of Political Science at Boston University and currently chairs the Department of Political Science. Her teaching focuses on international relations theory, international ethics, and normative change. Crawford received the Distinguished Scholar Award from the International Ethics section of the International Studies Association in 2018. Her research includes international relations theory, normative theory, foreign policy decision-making, sanctions, peace movements, discourse ethics, post-conflict peace building, research design, utopian science fiction, and emotion. Professor Crawford is also interested in methods for understanding the costs and consequences of war and is a co-director of the Eisenhower Study Group Costs of War Study based at Brown University. Dr. Crawford is the author of several books and scholarly journals. Professor Crawford is currently a member of several advisory and editorial boards. These include membership on the board of the Costs of War Project and the board of the Council for a Livable World. Professor Crawford was also a member of the editorial board of the American Political Science Review for 6 years. She is currently on the editorial board of several journals, including the Journal of Political Philosophy, International Relations, and Global Perspectives. She's a co-editor of the book series in International Theory at Bristol University Press. Professor Crawford has appeared on radio and TV and written op-eds on U.S. foreign policy and international relations for newspapers, including the Boston Globe, Newsday, Christian Science Monitor, the Washington Post, and the LA Times. Professor Crawford has a PhD in political science from MIT and a Bachelor of Arts from Brown University. Welcome, Dr. Crawford. Thank you for joining us this afternoon.
Thank you.
And then our very own Professor Kriner, who is our faculty director here at IOPGA. He is a Clinton Rossiter Professor in American Institutions in the Department of Government at Cornell University, and is a pleasure to work with. Doug, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right, thanks so much. And thanks so much to Professor Crawford and Dean Ohlin for being here. So let me just get things started with probably the simplest question. I know it caused quite a stir both here and in a lot of capitals in Europe when he said it, but was President Biden right when he called President Putin a war criminal?
I'll jump in there first. I think he was, unfortunately. There's a lot of bad stuff that's happening in Ukraine now. I think most of the debate is about, what crimes the Russian forces have committed. Internationally, there's 4 major crimes that people tend to focus on: aggression, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide. And while there was some debate sort of early on in the first few days of the invasion, a lot of the doubt has been removed since then. Certainly the clearest case is on aggression, because aggression is really a leadership level crime. It's designed to go after individuals who have the authority to direct the military and political affairs of the state. And certainly Putin really fits the bill. No one doubts that he's in charge. The situation with the other crimes become a little bit more controversial, because even if there are war crimes or genocide or crimes against humanity that's committed on the ground, there's always a question of how do you connect it up with the leadership level who is physically removed from the scene of the crime? And there are, doctrines and legal theories that you can use to connect them, but it's always a question of, do you have the facts to support that linkage? But for the crime of aggression, I think it's just absolutely clear that Putin is the one who's in charge and who's been directing it. Genocide, I think, and crimes against humanity, there's a closer connection with war crimes. Maybe there's a little bit of an argument that the military generals are more responsible for that, and that Putin, has some plausible deniability by virtue of his physical absence from the scene.
I tend to think that, yes, this is war criminal behavior in the part of President Putin, but, and I'll agree with everything that Dean Ohlin said. So yes to all of that, but I worry about the politics of calling Putin a war criminal. Okay, and how is that useful at this moment? Because the aggression's already occurred. The war crimes are continuing. And what we have here is an isolated leader who's facing the increasingly clear reality that he's not winning this war in the way he thought he was going to win this war. And he's getting, I believe, increasingly desperate. So I think that's actually likely to increase the commitment of war crimes by the Russian troops, in that they're escalating in order to try to bring the war to a close on terms favorable and likely to find President Putin's pleasure, or in other words, I think that it's not useful at this point to call this person a war criminal. though I do think it is, of course, after the fact, important to bring somebody to justice. And then in terms of the gathering of evidence, I believe that it's ongoing. We've seen that the evidence is available through third parties and through the Ukrainian government. They've been gathering the evidence. It will be available. So I don't see any political utility actually in President Biden's statement. So I wouldn't, if I were president, and I won't ever be, I wouldn't have made such a statement, though I think that it's fine for almost anybody else in the world besides heads of state to make such a statement and to make such a call. In addition, the prosecutors at the International Criminal Court have called Putin a war criminal, not formally, but again, I'm not sure that that's politically useful in terms of decreasing the crimes that the Ukrainian people are facing and their risks, including the risk of escalation.
I'll just jump in very quickly with one additional data point. I think all that's right, although I think there is one advantage to using that language. It increases the level of international support for Ukraine, and it makes states more likely to support Ukraine militarily, financially, diplomatically, intelligence, sharing of intelligence. Without that international support, it's doubtful that Ukraine would have lasted this long during the armed conflict. And the international community already has reasons for supporting Ukraine, but certainly the fact that Putin and the Russian regime have not only violated international law, but done so egregiously and possibly criminally, I think increases the level of international support for Ukraine. So that's the other side of the equation, I think.
Well, I don't know that it does, because I think it was pretty high before the bombings that we saw of apartment buildings. I think that we saw the coalition gather for devising and then implementing economic sanctions. I do believe that you don't have to call him a war criminal to witness the behavior and then react in those ways. Though, of course, it is important to name and shame, and that's what we're about right now. But the politics at the moment with this particular leader make me think it may not be too helpful. Now, in terms of, let's say, calling the behavior of the leader of Ethiopia and the invasion of Tigray a war crime, I think that might be more useful, since that's a Nobel laureate who cares about his reputation. But in this particular instance, I think the audience that Putin has is almost entirely domestic.
So much to follow up on all of these comments, but one thing I wanted to ask about, given sort of the fact that you both come at this from legal perspectives, from IR perspectives, but also both philosophy students as well. I was intrigued a little bit by a comment you made, Dean Ohlin, about the case for aggression, at least in the context of Putin being the clearest. And I think that for just sort of your average observer who doesn't come at this from a legal perspective, you see the pictures from Bucha and you're like, oh, those are the war crimes, right? And so I just wondered if we could talk for a minute about what aggression itself is being against international law and what that means. So, can you talk us through a little bit about how aggression is against international law? And then, of course, President Putin has tried to argue that this is a preemptive strike. And so that invokes some just war theory arguments. And maybe we could talk a little bit about that and preemption versus preventative war and what the distinctions are when we're in these questions about war crimes and what's illegal.
Yeah, so aggression really occupies a unique position in the overall constellation of international law and international crimes. So certainly the respect for sovereignty and the prohibition on the use of force is one of the central pillars, if not the central pillar, of the post-World War II legal order. It's enshrined as, one of the key concepts in the UN Charter. And by virtue of that, any state that violates the rules on the use of force, which philosophers call jus ad bellum and lawyers do as well, those states violate international law when they do so. In addition to that, you can have criminal responsibility for individuals who are involved at a leadership level in a state's violation of this core norm. The prohibition on aggressive war. That being said, aggression is almost, it's never been prosecuted since Nuremberg. So it's kind of ironic. It's this key norm. It was the paradigm around which the Nuremberg tribunals operated, somewhat famously so. There was, not only war crimes, but the Holocaust was perpetrated by the Nazi regime, but people forget that really the core legal argument and the core legal allegation against the Nazis at Nuremberg was waging this crime against peace, which is the language that eventually morphed into aggression. Since then, though, post-Nuremberg, aggression falls off the map, and no one is ever prosecuted again for aggression, mostly. And the International Criminal Court has this very complicated triggering mechanism for how to exercise jurisdiction over aggression. It makes it very difficult for the court. And none of those ad hoc tribunals, the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal, Rwandan War Crimes Tribunal, they didn't deal with aggression either. They dealt with war crimes and genocide and crimes against humanity. So it's this kind of funny thing that aggression occupies this privileged place conceptually and theoretically and on paper. But in terms of the practice of international criminal law since 1945, it's almost the kind of forgotten crime. Now, in terms of what Putin's arguments are, he has used pretext all over the place, mostly invoking genocide as an argument for why Russia had to do this, and therefore it doesn't constitute an aggression. And he was, came up with this pretext, this fiction. He made it up out of whole cloth that Ukraine was committing a genocide against Russian-speaking individuals in eastern Ukraine, and therefore that justified Russia's intervention. It was a pure legal fiction. It's based on misinformation and disinformation. Although now he's gone even further. He's taken that argument a step further, and he now says, Ukraine really isn't a people at all. It's really not a nation. It doesn't deserve sovereignty. It's really just a part of Russia, which is just an expansion of that prior argument.
So I would like to pick that apart a little bit more, though, and say that I think there are really three norms on the table here. And some of them are backed up by law, and some of them are international norms that are more customary. One is respect for sovereignty, which is the core principle that you just mentioned, right? You don't aggress on another country, take it over, right? You don't change borders with the use of force. So that's the UN Charter. But the second norm is it does allow for self-defense. And in the case of, you could argue that there is something like preemptive self-defense, and that's a very particular understanding of what is allowable. So it's a form of self-defense, but there's also a norm against preventive war. And what Putin has done, and again, pretext all over the place, not in many ways believable, is he's conflating preemption and preventive war, and which allows him, in his own mind, and maybe for others, to violate sovereignty. Okay, so the idea is that a preemptive war of self-defense is legitimate if and when it's launched in response to an imminent threat. And this doctrine goes back to the 19th century, a famous case where the British attacked a ship, the Caroline, in North America, that was outside Buffalo. And they destroyed the ship on the argument that it was a threat to the Canadian government and their sovereignty. But the thing that was argued by Daniel Webster was that no, it wasn't a preemptive attack because, as he said, there was no necessity of self-defense that was instant, and I'm quoting, overwhelming, leaving no choice of means, not excessive, just discriminating between the innocent and the guilty. In other words, what he's saying is there was no imminent threat, and the behavior thereafter went beyond even if there was an imminent threat, and it wasn't discriminating. So what we see is that preemption, the way he's defining it is in the negative, but preemption is allowable if those conditions obtain. In the case of Russia, those conditions did not obtain with regard to Ukraine. What they have done, though, is wage a preventive war, that is a war that is designed to maintain the current balance of power or not to allow the balance of power to change, and that is an aggressive war. The trouble is Americans were kind of confused about the difference between preventive war and preemption when the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. We called that preemption, but it was actually a preventive war. And we need these distinctions because they matter in terms of deciding whether something is aggression or self-defense. And the conditions here aren't self-defense.
So we've talked a good bit thus far about jus ad bellum. A question about jus in bello, taken from one of my colleagues who suggested it. Intentionality is such an important aspect of war crimes. And is there any sense that Russia is taking precautions at all to avoid killing civilians? Or on the contrary, what evidence do we have that the targeting is intentional if we were to move away from those aggression crimes towards some of the in bello war crimes that we see in the newspapers every day?
Great question, Doug. So obviously the reason why you've attacked or killed civilians is an important determination for whether it's criminal or not. Recall that under international law, collateral damage and civilian deaths are not per se illegal. Killing civilians can be consistent with the laws of war as long as they're not intentionally targeted. And even if they're unintentionally killed, that can be fine as long as the damage to civilians is not disproportionate to the value of the military objective. So it really matters why civilians have been killed. There's an argument that in some cases, the civilians have been intentionally attacked. You need evidence for that, but there's already been leaked reports of intercepts with communications between soldiers on the ground and their commanders, where the commanders have just said, level that apartment building, level that neighborhood, just, flatten it. And the strategy on the ground, seems to confirm this. It's not a situation where they're going after very targeted strikes against, a sniper in a building and at a high rise, and then, they take out a few extra floors on top of it. It's just flattening entire neighborhoods because they don't really have another military strategy that seems to be succeeding for them. So their strategy, which they used in Chechnya as well, is let's just, use artillery and other large weapons to flatten an entire neighborhood. There's also, even if you couldn't make that argument, I think there's enough factual support for that with these intercepts and also with the behavior on the ground. There's also another pathway to the same result, which is the prohibition against indiscriminate targeting of civilians. And that occurs really when an attacking force, they just send up the weapons and they don't even know where it's falling down because they just either don't care or they don't have the capacity to really discriminate between targets. And that's also a crime. And so even if they're not being intentional about it, if they're just saying, we don't care where the bombs land, that's also a war crime. And it's, described under this language of indiscriminate targeting of civilians.
I again agree with all of that, but I just wanted to think a little bit more about who's doing what here, because I think there's several layers of actors here. At the individual combatant level, I think it's clear that, or we've seen evidence that individual soldiers have, quote, snapped, gone berserk, and we've seen that there are individual criminal acts of people committing sexual violence or cruelty and so on. So that's at the individual level. At the command level, we see evidence that the Dean has described, that there are commands, and then at the organizational level, I think what we're seeing is the choice of weapons being used here, and the doctrine, which is escalation and indiscriminate fire. Some of the choice of weapons was made long before they got to the battlefield. Okay, so to have cluster munitions or to have weapons to bring them to the field, to purchase them in the first place, or to have them made, which have a low level of accuracy, cannot be targeted well, that last in a field well beyond their deployment in initial use. Those are choices that all militaries make, and we're seeing some of the consequences of that here. But I do believe that we could make an argument, or someone will make an argument, that there is command responsibility at the very highest level, because if Putin doesn't immediately know what's going on, he should know. And this is the standard in place since the war crimes tribunals that I think applies, the post World War II war crimes tribunals that I think applies here. And in terms of intentionality, I believe that again, if the consequence is that there's indiscriminate loss of life, and you see evidence of that, and you don't make any attempt to change behavior, then again, it's pretty clear that this is a crime.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, agree with everything 100%. I think there was a deliberate shift in tactics and strategy, which must have come from pretty high up in the chain of command, if not Putin, then certainly one level below him, which is to avoid the type of close infantry on the ground maneuvers, which during the early stages of the war proved disastrous for Russia, and for which they lost a huge number of assets. And in order to avoid losing that much manpower and that much equipment, they've decided, let's just surround, it's a siege warfare. Let's just stay on the perimeter of a city. And instead of going in with tank units and small infantry units that are going to be too easy for Ukrainian defensive forces to pick off, we're just going to have artillery units on hills or the outskirts and just lob stuff in, and we'll just stay here for weeks at a time until there's basically no city left. Right. And it's the nastiest form of warfare, but I think it's a very strategic shift because they realized their prior playbook was not working at all.
I think there's evidence for that, but I also think something else is going on. They don't have the material capacity to do some of the things that they were doing earlier on in the war. They're low on food, they're low on fuel, and they, in some instances, have run out of ammunition, and resupply is difficult. That's why they've retreated. But the other thing that is obviously going on here is that the escalation is based on a theory that if you pound someone hard enough, they'll submit, that they'll collapse. And this is a theory that is as old as war. And what we see is the other thing, which is that people don't quit. they resist. And so what you have here are two theories well, actually, one very old theory running up against the reality of human nature is that actually people don't want to be dominated and they will fight. But so I think there's a mix of things going on here.
Thank you. So in a recent interview, Jeffrey Sachs said that if the West wanted to prosecute Putin for war crimes, it would also have to prosecute Bush and Cheney for Iraq, Obama for Libya and Syria, and Biden for freezing Afghan assets after the Taliban takeover. If we can, setting these cases aside, the broader question I was really curious about your perspectives on is, how does the international community respond to such objections that failures to prosecute violations in some cases should preclude it from doing so in others?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, and I'd love to hear Professor Crawford's views on it as well. You know, to be perfectly honest, I've never understood the appeal of this argument. I think it's based on some core assumptions that I just don't share. You know, most of the complaints about hypocrisy or inconsistent standards or inconsistent application of legal standards to different factual scenarios, almost invariably they have to do with either the West or the United States in particular for prior military adventurism. But these arguments rarely have to do with Ukraine. And even if you take for the sake of argument that the United States or another Western power has been a bad actor at one particular point in time, that doesn't in any way lessen Ukraine's legal or moral ability to complain and say we are being mistreated in this instance. It doesn't make Ukraine any less the victim, and it doesn't make Russia any less an aggressor or a violator. And Ukraine, I think, has a legitimate argument and a legitimate demand for a more appropriate treatment under the circumstances. And I think that's what's important. And I think the mere fact, even if Ukraine had poorly treated others in the past, doesn't mean that somehow they can't appeal to the rules of international law. I mean, there's plenty of countries that have perpetrated all sorts of horrible misbehavior in the past, during World War II, for example. It's not as if now suddenly they can't complain about violations of international law simply because, in a prior generation, they were perpetrators of those abuses. I mean, it's just kind of a core principle, I think, of justice and fairness, that everyone is entitled to protection, and misbehavior in the past doesn't eliminate that need for protection.
I just wanted to recall the old saying, hypocrisy is the tribute that vice pays to virtue. And it works in this sense that, again, there are wrongs. There are many ways to bring people to account and to get them to be accountable. And a war crimes tribunal would not be the only means. And in the case where you have a government or a set of leaders that have done wrong, you can have a citizens tribunal. It doesn't have to be a formal tribunal. There can be investigative journalism. There can be censure. And there are many other ways besides international criminal courts or international courts of justice to get redress. And anyone who's concerned about those can use those or try to use those mechanisms. And I think that we should, if we see a wrong. But again, I have to be in violent agreement with the dean here. That's no argument not to pursue later, I believe later, a criminal complaint against the relevant individuals. though I don't think the politics of it in terms of ending this war in a way that doesn't lead to further escalation demand that we do this now.
It's interesting you mentioned that, because one thing that we've seen is, this is not a criminal case, by the way, but a case against Russia as a state. The Ukraine filed a case, an application against Russia before the International Court of Justice in The Hague, which is a tribunal that deals solely with state responsibility. And their argument for conferring jurisdiction, or for the court assuming jurisdiction, was very innovative and very clever. And the ICJ seemed to go out of its way to not only accept Ukraine's very clever argument about why it had jurisdiction over the case, but it also the court moved with great alacrity, with great vigor, and really seemed to be motivated to insert itself into an ongoing situation in a way that the International Court of Justice has historically not done. So it has traditionally been very conservative. It's traditionally taken a back seat to the Security Council, to the General Assembly, to other organs which have more primary responsibility for securing or restoring international peace and security. But, and their cases typically take years to unfold, but they held an oral hearing very quickly after the application was filed by Ukraine. They almost never did that. After the oral proceedings, they filed they issued an order on Ukraine's request for provisional measures. They almost never do that quickly. They ordered Russia to cease their military campaign and withdraw its forces from Ukraine, and they did all of this within a space of weeks. And I think it was an attempt by the ICJ really to insert itself in a kind of muscular way into the process and to try and be more of a player, presumably because it was making a calculation which I think is different from Professor Crawford, which I don't pass judgment on either side, but they seem to be operating from the assumption that they might do some good by inserting themselves into the conflict in the here and now.
Yeah, it's not clear. I think we'll have to see if they've done any good, but the evidence, I would suggest, says that you treat it not in the legal sense, but in the political sense and in the military sense, you treat a democracy differently than you do an authoritarian state. And in fact, this isn't even authoritarian, it's a totalitarian state. We've got one person basically in charge, and what I'm saying is that the wrong is the wrong is the wrong. But in terms of saving lives and ending the war more quickly without escalation, I think that this may or may not be counterproductive. But I don't think it's going to have much impact. And I do think that, again, cornering the bully, in this instance, a leader who's in a classic legitimation problem, classic legitimation crisis, is not necessarily useful. Though I think that these statements of clear statements about what is right and what is wrong are useful. And they send signals to the rest of the international community. It might be that the sanctions, which were done well before, at least put on track well before the aggression began, would be bolstered by such a declaration or not. But I think that all of this could happen with or without the intervention of the International Court of Justice or any criminal court, and it would be probably more effective.
Before I ask one final question, Emily, would you please give some instructions to our audience for how they can pose questions to Dean Ohlin and Professor Crawford?
Sure. If you would like to ask our speakers a question, you could do so by raising your hand to ask a question live, or you could submit a question in the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen.
Thank you. And so just one final question that sort of piggybacks a little bit on the last discussion about the International Criminal Court, then the International Criminal Court of Justice, and the Security Council was invoked. And so my question is just, with Russia as a veto-wielding permanent member of the UN Security Council, has the UN outlived its charter and usefulness? Are major reforms needed, or are there other mechanisms that still can make international law enforceable, given sort of the realities that we have on the ground?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is really turning out to be an existential crisis for the United Nations, or certainly for the Security Council as the most powerful organ within the United Nations. Just to back up for a second, the UN Charter outlines the authority of the various organs of the organization. And the Security Council is this small entity which has by far the most power within the UN. It really dwarfs the General Assembly and the International Court of Justice and the Secretary General, who's the executive, but has very limited authority on his or her own. The Security Council is really the core power base within the UN, and Russia's place as a veto holding member of the Security Council is really producing a kind of paralysis. Honestly, that's not entirely new. There were decades and decades when the Security Council was very much paralyzed by Cold War politics by virtue of its membership. So it's not exactly as this is a new dynamic, but it's really focused people's attention on it. Without stating explicitly what I think the world should do about this, I would just say there's no great options. The UN was very much built upon this idealist, realist compromise, which is that the victors of World War II were given special protection and disproportionate power because they were on the Security Council and have the veto. You could propose a more equitable version of the United Nations, but what you would trigger is first of all, it would be hard to negotiate that because it's hardwired into the UN Charter. But you would get immediately the US, Russia, China to withdraw from the United Nations. And a United Nations without United States, without Russia, without China, I worry that a more equitable UN would overnight become basically the League of Nations. It would become this irrelevant organization that it wouldn't be a clearinghouse for discussion and resolution of the world's most pressing problems. It would become this academic sideshows. That's really the concern here. And I honestly don't know what the answer is.
I don't have an answer either, but I do want to raise a couple of other international organizations and entities that might be helpful to recall. One is the General Assembly is another venue that is egalitarian, and I think that's still quite useful, even if and when the Security Council is paralyzed. Recall that when the Security Council was paralyzed over the question of the status of South Africa, and in particular its behavior against Angola, Mozambique, and Southwest Africa, the General Assembly is the venue where the sanctions first began. And another venue to keep in mind is the European Union, which is not only a political union, it is a venue and a location for security dialogue. And then there's the fact of Russia's increasing isolation, in a bilateral diplomatic sense, which I think is important. So there are other ways to send signals than through the often paralyzed Security Council. So I look to those in these instances. And then there's the NATO alliance itself. It's not a place where Russia will make claims, but it is a venue for the international community, the members of the NATO alliance anyway, to have a common orientation and to take common stance towards Russian aggression. So I think there's a lot more going on. I'm not so disappointed.
Let me just respond quickly to some of those. I'm inspired to say a couple of things about that. It's very interesting the way the General Assembly has been really provoked to be more active and interventionist in this crisis than they have in the past, partly because I think, like the ICJ, they see the paralysis on the Security Council, and so they've decided, at least initially when they had that initial vote condemning Russia, that they maybe had a role to play. There's a history behind this with the Uniting for Peace resolution, where, decades ago, the General Assembly thought about taking a much more aggressive role in international peace and security when the Security Council doesn't act. They then largely retreated from that promise, and in the ensuing decades didn't really live up to the sort of path that they had laid out for themselves in the Uniting for Peace resolution. But now they've sort of reappeared. And so it's a big question, like, are we going to see a much more aggressive General Assembly acting on the world stage? Couple of points about that. One, I'd be curious whether or not that's a good thing, in contrast to the ICJ being, pushing its way into the forefront, or does the General Assembly trying to call out, name and shame, and isolate Russia, does it, provoke some of the same concerns that Professor Crawford had about Putin and escalating the situation? The other is the second votes from the General Assembly, the next month, really were not as unanimous, and Russia pressured a lot of states to either vote against the resolution or to abstain. And Russia made a lot of progress with getting more people on the General Assembly to their side. So very complicated dynamic there. So we'll sort of see what happens.
Yeah.
Just one other quick thing I wanted to mention is there is someone asked in the chat, like, is there some way of going after Russia and just sort of removing Russia's veto? I did want to mention there's this argument that's being floated around about having a vote in the United Nations about whether or not Russia is actually the successor to the Soviet Union, and declaring them actually not the successor and therefore not entitled to the veto that was formerly given to the USSR. I don't think it's going to happen, but it's actually a very clever idea. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, Professor Crawford.
Yeah, I think that is clever. One thing that I want to be clear about is that I'm talking in general about these international institutions. I think, again, everything we say has to be tailored to the moment that we're in, with an eye to, of course, the past and the future. But in the moment that we're in, I think that the role of the General Assembly and other institutions has to be united in sanctioning and then supporting Ukraine. So I don't think, again, that the role of the General Assembly to call out, to name and shame, that's actually not so useful, though I think it is correct.
I think we have one question from a caller or a participant with their hand raised.
Yes. Okay, Barry, you are allowed to talk.
I have a substantive and a procedural question, and the substantive one isn't a reflection of my questioning your expertise, but because I admire it. In the last few years, there was a lot of talk about treason, and we learned that, like many other causes of action, there were specific elements, like you had to be at war or have a declared war. But when I listen to you, and admiringly, I still come away with the sense that war, criminal, genocide, and some of these other terms are mushier than we would like them to be. The substantive question, the procedural question is, I remember how Israel got Eichmann. I remember how the Germans wound up at The Hague, but what on earth would you have to do to get Putin to be accountable?
Yeah, so let me jump in there with the second one first because I have a better handle on answering it than the first one. So it's going to be very hard for any court to exercise criminal jurisdiction over a defendant and capture them, though not impossible. For mid-level commanders who are captured on the battlefield in Ukraine, Ukraine has a chance to capture them because they've also been killing them. It's possible that they could, capture a commander who is responsible for war crimes and, would have, then the possibility to either try them in Ukraine or transfer them to an international court, such as the ICC. In terms of anyone at the leadership level who's in Russia, of course, it's going to be incredibly hard to get that individual to The Hague. When that happens, the most likely scenario is regime change. So a country goes through regime change and then they decide, hey, the easiest way of getting rid of this domestic political problem is to ship them off to The Hague or some other court. That would actually not be a bad thing. I mean, that happened to Milosevic. It's happened many times in other countries. That's probably not going to happen in Russia, but it's the most likely scenario, and it's a pretty pretty unlikely eventuality. In terms of precision, I actually think that the definitions of war crimes are pretty precise. It's an area of the law that's gotten a lot of attention. It's very legalistic. There's a lot of precision associated with so many lawyers who are working in this area now. So I'm a little bit more optimistic about it than you are. I do have to say that there are some areas of the law that I think are just easier to prosecute than others. So, for example, aggression, like I said before, it's very hard to give the ICC jurisdiction over aggression because of the way it's been set up. And then also the crime of causing disproportionate collateral damage, that almost never gets prosecuted as well. But in terms of the technical definitions, I'm more optimistic than you are.
I'll essentially agree. So next.
So excellent. We still have 8 minutes, which means that this won't be the last question, because I promised Professor Crawford that it would not be, and we would not end on the note. But there are issues, there are some questions in the Q&A that have been raised about the potential escalation of Russia's military involvement in Ukraine to include weapons of mass destruction, whether it's threats to use nuclear weapons, concerns from American intelligence that chemical weapons have been moved toward the front, et cetera. How do we assess sort of the likelihood of this, whether or not even just sort of the saber rattling has eroded international norms, and what are the longer term legal implications for what we've seen in recent weeks?
Right. So I think that the nuclear weapons use is always possible at any time because of the risk of accident and miscalculation. And we have very narrowly in history since the late 1940s avoided some of those accidents and those inadvertent escalations. And I'm glad we have. So, but nuclear weapons use is always possible. Deliberate use by Russia of tactical or even a larger nuclear weapon is possible. And when Putin said that he was giving the order to the special forces to be ready to do something, that was a signal that's not actually technically part of their the chain of command and how these orders would be given, but it's a signal. I think it's a rhetorical device, but the nuclear use is still possible. How could it occur? It could be the case that President Putin says to his commanders, let's use a small nuclear weapon in the atmosphere to try to intimidate the Ukrainians and to demonstrate to the international community that our will is strong and we intend to fight till victory. I think that is possible. Would the commanders actually do it is another question. I think also possible is the use of chemical weapons. Now, both nuclear weapons and chemical weapons are not very useful if what you want to do is go immediately occupy the territory afterwards, right? So in a sense, it would be illogical to do so, and it raises the likelihood or the potential for the United States to respond in kind. So it is possible. And then that the border between, the last thing I'll say about this is the border between conventional war and nuclear war has always been and it is increasingly slippery. And I worry about that. I think that we've got two sides, the United States and Russia, who believe that it is possible to use a tactical nuclear weapon in a conventional war and for it to stop there. And I'm worried about escalation dynamics. So it is possible. I don't know if it's likely. I don't even know what to say about it anymore because we're dealing with a regime that's in trouble, and their doctrine says that if the regime is facing an existential threat, that it is possible that the state's existence is at risk, they can and will use nuclear weapons. That's what their doctrine says.
Yeah, I'm particularly concerned about that, especially because of the way Putin has framed this war effort, which seems to have gotten more extreme over time. At first, it seemed as if this was, a special military, operation that was, something that could be separated from the rest of the Russian raison d'etre and Putin's, self-perception. But he's staked so much on this now, and he's declared it to be basically a part of the Russian people, so that a threat against Ukraine and the inability to consolidate control over Ukraine, he's framed it in these existential terms. So that, I think, raises the risk of escalation even further. So it's very scary.
I think we have time for one more question. At the risk of asking sort of like something that's too anodyne, from your different perspectives, whichever element you most like to focus on professionally, what do you see coming down the pike? Not necessarily just the standard, how does this end, but what does the next 3 to 6 months look like, either sort of geopolitically in the region or with what's going on in ICJ and the rest of the international community's response? What do you see?
Well, I'll start first. See how the sanctions play out, I think is what's going to be really important. We haven't talked a huge amount about that, but it's really taking its toll, and there's a lot of pressure on Putin and indirect pressure through the business class, which I think is going to be placing a lot of pressure on him, and we'll see how he responds to that. I can't predict the future, and I don't know, but it's clearly having an impact on the economy in Russia. And then for me, one thing that I haven't said so much in the prior answers is that there's no bailiff in the sky that's going to come in and enforce international law magically, but law is all over the place. And that's what, from my perspective, is kind of important to remember. Law is very much structuring a lot of this dispute and a lot of the response to it, and is very relevant in that way.
I see a number of things over the next several months. Some of them are good, some of them bad. First, I think that we've already seen it a little bit, is that the United States and its allies will increase their military spending. This military spending is in some ways unsustainable for the US, though we've been sustaining it at great domestic cost. And it's hard to even see that cost in some ways because it's taken for granted. But the NATO allies will also, all of them perhaps, increase their military spending. Secondly, what we're going to see two things. The Ukrainians will likely maintain their strong resistance using tactics which we didn't think would work against the Russians in the past, which is territorial defense combined with conventional defense. And that tells me that NATO has been spending a lot of money to defend against the Russian, and then prior to that, the Soviet threat, that it probably didn't need to spend, because you can have a country be bogged down for months by using, relatively light forces using defense in depth. So it tells me that we ought to be rethinking the structure of NATO and military spending. Lastly, I think what we're going to see, I hope, is some change in Russian politics. Now, either the change will be, fewer and fewer people will be out there protesting, and there's a tightening of control, or we'll see elite fracture, or we may see both elite fracture and more people out there protesting. Now, so the tightening of control scenario is, very worrisome. How long can Putin keep this up is a good question. But I think that it is possible we'll see some changes in domestic politics. It's just not clear which direction they will go. And then finally, I think that this is a real moment of clarity that reinforces the norm that we've had for many decades, that aggression is wrong, and that these things have to be prevented. It's easier to prevent aggression through diplomacy and through economic tools than to try to fight it after it's occurred. But I think what we've seen is the norm against aggression is strengthened.
That was incredibly uplifting to end on a note of norm strengthening, as opposed to constantly talking about norm erosion, as political scientists seem to want to do these days. Professor Crawford, thank you so much for joining us. Dean Ohlin, thank you so much for your time. And thank you to both of you for sharing your expertise. Thanks to all of our audience members for joining us. Again, our upcoming events were all in the chat. They're on the Cornell events calendar. They're on our webpage as well. We very much hope to welcome you to another one of those in the future. Thanks again to everyone, and good night.
Thank you.